Today we're in Psalm 44. O God, we have heard with our ears. Our fathers have told us what deeds you performed in their days, in the days of old. You with your own hand drove out the nations, but them you planted. You afflicted the peoples, but them you set free. For not by their own sword did they win the land, nor did their own arm save them, but your right hand and your arm, and the light of your face, for you delighted in them. You are my King, O God, ordained salvation for Jacob. Through you we push down our foes. Through your name we tread down those who rise up against us. For not in my bow do I trust, nor can my sword save me. But you have saved us from our foes, and have put to shame those who hate us. In God we have boasted continually, and we will give thanks to your name forever. But you have rejected us and disgraced us, and have not gone out with our armies. You've made us turn back from the foe, and those who hate us have gotten spoil. You've made us like sheep for slaughter and have scattered us among the nations. You've sold your people for a trifle, demanding no high price for them. You've made us the taunt of our neighbors, the derision and scorn of those around us. You've made us a byword among the nations, a laughingstock among the peoples. All day long my disgrace is before me, and shame has covered my face. At the sound of the taunter and reviler, at the sight of the enemy and the avenger, all this has come upon us, though we have not forgotten you, and we have not been false to your covenant. Our heart has not turned back, nor have our steps departed from your way. Yet you have broken us in the place of jackals, and covered us with the shadow of death. If we had forgotten the name of our God, or spread out our hands to a foreign God, would not God discover this? For he knows the secrets of the heart. Yet for your sake we are killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. Awake! Why are you sleeping, O Lord? Rouse yourself. Do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face? Why do you forget our affliction and oppression? For our soul is bowed down to the dust. Our belly clings to the ground. Rise up. Come to our help. Redeem us for the sake of your steadfast love. Psalm 44 is just cram-packed with things that confront us, that trouble us, that also offer comfort and instruction in how we're to pray, particularly in the midst of pain and in the midst of suffering. And so I want to look at just a handful of them. First, the foundation of this psalm is the first three verses. In these three verses, the psalmist brings to remembrance the stories that he's heard his whole life, that they've heard their whole life, about God's redemptive acts in the past, particularly alluding to the Exodus, alluding to Israel coming into Canaan. How God has kept his promises. He's been faithful to the covenant. He's met them again and again and again. At the foundation for all Christian life, all prayer, all of us going before God, begins with knowing, remembering, telling, singing the stories of God's faithfulness to us again and again and again. This is the job of pastors and parents and brothers and sisters and friends, to tell one another again, here's what God has done. Oh, pastors, that we would be a people who proclaim over and over, and who never grow weary and tired of telling the old stories of God's faithfulness. That is our primary task, to draw our people back to remember what God has done, to remember supremely what he's done in Jesus, the great Exodus, how he's conquered and brought us out from slavery to sin and death, in the death and resurrection of Jesus. This is why Holy Week is so vital, so important, why every Good Friday we remember the cross, every Easter we remember the resurrection. Not as just some sort of vague hope, but as a specific remembrance of a moment in history, a time in history when God demonstrated, mightily demonstrated, his covenant faithfulness. But we're not just to remember the acts of that we find in the Bible, although supremely there. To go back to the Exodus, to go back to God's kindness to Israel and to God's people, the church, throughout the book of Acts, and through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. We should also tell stories from our more recent history, stories of God's kindness, God's acts to redeem his people, to rescue his people, to save his people. Stories of missionaries going into nations, proclaiming the gospel, and God acting mightily to save people. These stories should be constantly told and celebrated among the people of God as a way of establishing the soil, the foundation out of which all prayer, all imploring of God's kindness grow out from. We're a people who attribute to God this mighty vision of a God who saves, redeems, and acts decisively and over and over and over again, not in vague, mere realm of ideas, but in history, saving real people at real times, rescuing them, redeeming them, glorifying his name, and demonstrating his love for his people. And so everything else the psalmist prays in this psalm is built on that first foundation, a remembering of God's mighty acts. So it's built there. The second thing I want to draw your attention to is that there is this kind of unashamed, like unbashful way of attributing to God and God's volition the suffering of God's people. It's interesting that this psalm it is actually super clear that the cause of this suffering isn't their sin, isn't their disobedience, isn't their forgetfulness of who God is. Rather, they haven't done those things. They've actually, according to the psalmist here, they've walked according to God's ways. They've been faithful to the covenant that God has established for them. And yet they look around at them, at the suffering that they're enduring, at the pain they're enduring, at the taunts that they're enduring from godless people about how they're being dragged off to slaughter. And they don't primarily turn to and blame the circumstances around them and blame the people around them. They turn to God and say, you have done this. You've forgotten us. You've cast us off. You've done these things. And I don't think this can be chalked up to well, they feel rejected by God, but they're really not. In the end, the psalmist, rightly, I believe, points to God and says, you providentially rule every single facet of my life, both the good, the blessed history that we've recounted over and over again, and the trouble I'm enduring now, the pain I'm enduring now. God, you rule over all of it. You cause all of it. You're behind all of it. In our day, it's become mocked, belittled, to say those kinds of things about God. But we love to receive the blessings of God and then to say maybe God permits or maybe God remains passive or remains distant when things are troubling or difficult or sorrowful. And yet this kind of leaves us in this bind where we can never turn to God and look at our lives and say, God has brought good into my life and he's brought evil into my life. And then therefore look to God and say, God, remove the evil and bring back the good. Redeem us like you did of old. Rescue us like you did of old. The Bible through and through, is completely unbashful about this. It's not afraid at all at looking at circumstances, difficult circumstances. Circumstances brought out through the sin of others, difficulties brought out through the persecution of others, through natural disasters, through viruses. It's not ashamed at all to say, God, you've done this. You've brought this about. Paul actually will allude to this psalm in Romans in describing the persecution of Christians by the Romans, that all day long we are led away to slaughter. And in the end, by quoting that, he's not alleviating the responsibility that the Romans have for their sin. But he is saying ultimately, behind every other means is a God who providentially rules all the circumstances of our lives. And if we lose that, we lose a number of different things. One, I believe we actually lose the ability to pray and ask for God to rescue us, to move us out of the circumstances that he's brought us into. But more importantly, I think suffering then has the horrible danger of becoming meaningless. And the Bible never lets us see suffering as meaningless. You see, if suffering is just crap happens, God just permits crap to just kind of unfold in our lives without us seeing it, well then it's meaningless. And all we can do is hope that somehow God will decide to intervene and let us bring us out of it. But if God using all kinds of means, wielding all kinds of tools, surgical tools in our life, is not only using blessings and kindnesses and mercy, not only using a word, the law and grace and mercy and instruction from his word, but also using pain and suffering and using them intentionally. Oh, that means there's not a single tear that is shed that is wasted. There's not 1 ounce of pain. There's not one death. There's not one difficulty, no matter where it comes from on a lateral level. Vertically, we know that God in his providence and his kindness leads us, directs us leads and directs all the circumstances of our lives for our good. And the last two things are connected, and they're actually the ground at which we can say it's for our good. The first thing is that in this psalm, the psalmist isn't praying primarily as an individual, but as a member of the covenant community. There is a we at the heart of this psalm. We live in a radically individualized day in which we primarily see even the church as kind of a collection of random individuals who happen to come together, and maybe we like each other, and maybe we eat together, maybe we sing together, but not as a community before God, not as a family before God, not as a tribe before God. And as a result, in a day and age in which there's massive confusion because we weren't made to exist as atomized individuals. People are scrambling to find tribes anywhere, identifications anywhere. And so we tend to find our identification, our community with our race or with our socioeconomic background, our political background, even what region of the nation we come from. When the Bible kind of sweeps all of that aside and says, no, foundationally, who you are is a member of this thing, this people called the church, this community that has been bought by the blood of Jesus and exists as a community before him. So in our suffering, in our trouble, not only do we go to God as individuals, we go to him as a community, the community called the church. And at the root of that community's identity is the covenant love of God. There's covenant language starting in verse 4 when the psalmist and the people with that psalmist declare God as their king and call upon him as their king to act on their behalf. But also, even most explicitly, in verse 26, it says, "Rise up, come to our help, redeem us." Why? For the sake of your steadfast love. That steadfast love in the Bible is not mere sentiment. It's the covenant love of God. It's God who has bound his name to us, to our good, to our holiness. That he cannot leave us. He can't forsake us. He won't walk away. He's bound himself in covenant love to his people. And so all of the calls in this psalm for God to rescue us, to God to redeem us, for God to turn away this judgment, this pain, this suffering that he's brought about is grounded in a hope. A hope that is our covenant God, that he is our covenant God, he is our king, that he rules over us in love.